But thanks to Shearwater for hosting us, and I do encourage everyone to enjoy some drinks, and afterwards if you want to stay for dinner, then you're more than welcome to do that too. So thanks to Shearwater for putting that on. And then Etienne, I don't know how I started this one. I normally talk about the person in a positive way, but I do know him quite well, and he went to the same school as I did, and unfortunately he was in an inferior house. But welcome here, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and I look forward to learning something.
Hopefully.
So thank you. If you need any help there, you've got a cameraman there to help you out.
Fair enough. Evening, everybody. Let me just crack on to the next slide. So my name's Etienne and I'm based out at Zimbabwe Conservancy, or the Africa Center for Holistic Management. We've all got our perceptions of the Africa Center. There's this place that's got herding cattle beyond the airport, but what we do fundamentally is we use cattle as a way to regenerate the bush in that area, to mimic nature, so to speak. But there's a lot of information around this evening that I'm going to challenge, that I'm going to add to, fill some gaps and everything like that, because there's this perception globally, if we rewild an environment and we just let nature be, that it's fine. The point that you'll see as comes through the talk this evening, that it's not. That animals need to behave in a certain way to get that, and if you leave an environment just to do its thing, it can deteriorate, and we'll start to look at that. And so one of the things we'll look at tonight is, I've just mentioned that we'll be challenging certain conventional understandings. I'm going to provide you with some more new information. I'm going to fill some gaps in existing information, and I'll be talking relatively to the context of Matabeleland North and the wider Kaza region. And by no means is this all the information. Just to explain the title a little bit, I mentioned ruminants and environmental health. What I am talking about generally is all animals, not just ruminants, and the role that they play. But as an example, we'll be talking about ungulates and your ruminants, basically your hoofed animals. Now, the title itself, for me to proceed, I need to explain what do I mean by environmental health. What does a healthy environment look like, and more importantly, how do you measure that health? How do you determine if it's healthy or not? Now, the way that we look at it is through the processes that has created that environment, the ecosystem processes, the water cycle, energy flow, mineral cycle, and community dynamics, and I'll go through each of those. These are the processes that the environment, that created the environment in essence. If we first look at the water cycle, you can see clearly from the picture on the right, there's an ineffective water cycle. On the left there is, and that leads to the first question, is how effective is rainfall? And basically when you're looking at the water cycle, is when a water droplet lands on grass, what does it do? Does that water work, or does it hit the ground and run straight off? So how effective is that? Next is energy flow. So how much of that sunlight, and everything that's driven is driven by sunlight, how much of that sunlight hits a green leaf and the only way we can catch the sunlight that comes every morning from the east and 12 hours later sets in the west is when it hits a green leaf. So how much of that environment is green to catch that energy, hold it, and put it back into the soil? Then we talk about the mineral cycle. I've got a normal life cycle there. When I talk about a mineral cycle, it's all the various minerals that you might find. Carbon is all the rage at the moment, but it can't just be carbon. There's so much other stuff that needs to be cycled healthily, and how it does is through biology. And the biology is born, it grows, it dies, and it decays. If any one of these points fails, then mineral cycling failed. And in our region, this is the area here that is probably the biggest concern for our environment. Is once things don't decay properly, and I'm meaning decay biologically, not chemically, not through oxidation or through fire or anything, it needs to decay biologically. Why that is important is those nutrients to go back into cycle. If it oxidizes or it burns, it's straight up into the air, we lose it. All that energy that we've caught from the sunlight is gone now. So we've spoken of water cycle, energy flow, and mineral cycling, and what gets this mechanism going is community dynamics. The animals, they are the ones that take all these other things and process it. But for community to be healthy, first, all the role players have to be there. The buzzword is biodiversity. All the players need to be here. And often we just focus on biodiversity and say all the players are here, the environment must be healthy. But there's two other steps to that. Is the species healthy? Each individual species, and how we look at that is through the age-sex structure. A good example would be the albida trees in Mana Pools. They're all big old trees. When you go there, do you see young ones? Do you see teenagers? Do you see young adults? Very few. It's just big old trees. So in a biodiversity check, yes, there's albidas there, but in terms of their health, in terms of the health of the species, they're not in a good place. The next is, now we're speaking generally specifically to animals, are the individuals behaving correctly? So you could have an animal there, it could be, the species could be healthy, but if it's not behaving correctly, you could have a problem. An example would be, for example, the Chobe National Parks. The elephants are there, the elephant population's healthy, but because they're behaving incorrectly, the bush looks like it's being wrecked. So the behavior needs to correspond in a natural way. What that is, I can't tell you, but we can tell you that the behavior is incorrect, hence you're starting to see signs within the environment that things are getting poor. So it's through those four things that we grade an environment. And so when we assess the health of these four, it's as if you're looking into a building with four windows, and you can look at that building through the lens of the water cycle. Is the water cycle happening? And there's a lot of markers that we use. Mineral cycle, same thing. One of the markers we use for checking mineral cycling is the dung that you're seeing on the ground older than a season or younger than a season. If the mineral cycling is happening quickly, elephant dung would not be going grey, it would be cycling quite quickly. So it's an indicator that your cycling is happening and it's healthy. If we're looking at energy flow, as I've mentioned, is there green stuff catching light? And community dynamics is the life. So that's how you assess the health. How you manage it is you manage it as a whole. A great analogy would be a puppet. A great analogy would be a puppet. With those puppeteers, when they're working with those puppets, they're not thinking, I'm moving the right, left, or the right wrist corresponding to my left ankle. They don't think there's too much complexity in that to try and, all that they've done is built the puppeteer in such a way that they move the center of gravity. And by moving the center of gravity, everything else falls in place. And you've got this lifelike movement of these puppets. How we manage an environment is the same thing. We don't worry about individual things. We don't manage individual species. We make sure the environment is healthy and going in the right direction. Everything else should fall into place. Okay. So that's some of the prelude to the information. So some new things that filling some gaps. Now, traditionally, how we define environments would be through vegetation, geology, climate. I want to introduce a new way of defining environments tonight, and that's how effective is the environment of cycling biomass, dead material. Because there are environments that have got seasonal moisture at soil level throughout the year. Think your equatorial forests on the equator. And then there are environments like ours that we have rains and then it gets dry. And then you've got 8 months of dry season in front of you. How these two environments cycle nutrients are fundamentally different. And a great example would be London versus Johannesburg. They get roughly about the same amount of rain. I think it's about 650 to 700 mils. There might be a variance between them, but generally. But London gets it over 10 to 11 months of the year, very well spaced out, and Johannesburg gets it in 4 months. Same amount of rain, two very different situations. What does that translate to? Let me just explain. Let me show you a picture. So the utter extremes would be here, 12 months of the year. There's moisture at soil level throughout the year. The other extreme is brittle, the Namib Desert that gets rain every 50 or 60 years. So how these two environments cycle nutrients is very, very different. In your non-brittle, what we refer to as non-brittle, environments, if you had to imagine a leaf, and a leaf falls down and lands on the ground in an area where there's moisture throughout the year, the soil is literally going to eat that leaf up, and it will cycle quite quickly. Just think of the rainforest here. There's moisture constantly there, and you don't need a big thing there to process that for you. On the contrary, an environment like us, on the edge of the Kalahari, we've got 4 months of rain and then everything goes down. Why this is significant is you'll have this sudden growth of material, and then biological cycling goes inactive. So now by the time the next rains come, you've still got, if I can use an example of a single grass plant, it grows, nothing eats it in the 8 months of dry. Next season, there's a blockage here, new leaves can't grow because, so there's a mechanism here that we need to chat about, or a process about how do we get rid of that dry grass. Now traditionally ranchers would just go burn it, but again, that's releasing it back into the air. But how do we process that so to provide those growth points a place to come out of? Interestingly enough, in a non-brittle environment, for example, a rainforest, if you started with bare ground, because there's soil moisture and the soil biome and the biology is so active, you'll get this natural succession of plants to a climax community at the end. This is what we would have learnt at school. It starts with bare ground and eventually becomes a forest. That's true in a non-brittle environment. In our brittle environments, it doesn't happen that way. There will be some progress, but it will never reach a climax community in our environment. In our environment, you get that growth, and if nothing cycles that nutrients, there's a block. And what happens, and this explains it, so there's this growth, I don't know if you can see it, and then there's the blockage there, and then you end up with moribund at the other side. Great example would be, this is a picture from the US, a research site there, and then all they did was remove all the animals, and the first picture was in the 70s, and this one is in 2002. You look at the gaps of bare soil between individual plants. It's completely deteriorated. And that's just on the assumption that if you leave the environment and let it rewild it, that it will get better. That's true in an area where there's moisture at soil surface level all the year. In an area like ours, if you just leave it, it deteriorates. So you have to engage with it. So in our environments, what processed that dry grass over the winter months? Where is the biology that could process that? Well, it's in the gut and the rumen of animals. They would eat it, process it. If they didn't cycle it itself, what came out the other end is a buffalo pat. When the rains do come, the nutrients are ready to be cycled really quickly. They're fine, they're good to go. So it gives you an indication of how much life was here and our perception of how much animals were here historically. Because if you're driving to Bulawayo, you see all that grass. Traditionally, all that grass would need to be cycled within 2 or 3 seasons. That's a lot of animals. I'm not saying they were here all the time, they obviously moved, but things moved in and dealt with that biomass. And if it doesn't, it starts to deteriorate. And that leads to the next sort of point, is time and not animal numbers determine environmental recovery. Our perception, what I mean by recovery, this is a very simple sigmoid curve. Over here, a population's establishing. It's when you introduce a new species into an area or repopulate an area. This is when the population's still vulnerable. Then eventually the population grows and it becomes a little stronger, and now they can recover. Now that starts growing. If that population, if you leave them, it will start to plateau and eventually might deteriorate. We see it with herds of buffalo and herds of cattle in the communal area. Because they're not managing their cattle in a proactive way by removing old animals and stuff, the whole herd starts to deteriorate. Even young animals look weak and sick and elderly because old animals are there and they're more susceptible to get disease and stuff. So you have to manage this. And we also see it in our children. This is a biological term. And with my kids, when I introduce a new concept at school to them, here they're vulnerable. They don't quite know what I'm talking about. Then eventually they start to understand, and then they expand. If I disengage and leave them alone, they'll start to plateau, lose interest, and deteriorate. I have to challenge them again and bring them back. So we want recovery is where the bush and the environment is at its most productive. So we want stuff here. Okay, conventional belief is that there are too many animals, or to prevent environmental degradation, we have to remove animals. The elephants would be the perfect example of that. It's a great debate and a hotly contested subject of how many elephants do we have. But to say that an environment, that there's too many animals, there's an element of truth to that. You put too many animals in a small area, they're going to wreck it. So now the question is, how many do you have to remove for that to not be true anymore? How many elephants do we have to remove from Wange or Chobe for them not to destroy it? Everyone's taking thumbsucks at this number. The truth is, all of them. If your paradigm is that animals create damage, then you have to remove all of them. Yet that's in conflict with also our common sense. So there has to be something else that's at play here. Well, and I'm going to use the example of cattle now. So let's look at conventional, typical understanding of what happens. There's a healthy plant. A buffalo comes and grazes it. Once it's removed the grass, what it's in essence has done is remove the solar panels. The only place where this grass can start growing again is from free nutrients and energy that was on its way to the roots originally from the grass. On its way now it gets rediverted, comes back up to start replenishing the solar panels, because you need the solar panels to eventually replace the battery. Once it's grazed, it moves the nutrients to build leaf. Once the leaf's established, it re-establishes root. What overgrazing is before the recovery of the leaf, the cow or a buffalo comes back and re-eats it. So the battery has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually you end with that because the grass is starting to die. This is actually taken on Dibangombe in the early years, right in the beginning. So to answer to the question that I posed earlier, how many animals do you have to remove so there's no damage? Well, if overgrazing is individual plants that get weaker and weaker and weaker, then it's individual animals and their time availability to the grass that is the problem. So you'd have to remove all of them. Yet, I'll get to how we manage it. Sorry, I saw your eyes perk up with a bit of curiosity, and I'll get there. Just to show you the difference. And what the problem is a lingering animal. It's one animal that lingers, and it's usually by water and just stays there. Whenever the grass grows, it comes and eats it again. Grass grows, starts and eats it again. So this deterioration in the corner will eventually infect the whole area. So one cow, given enough time, or one buffalo, given enough time, can overgraze 1 million hectares, given enough time. So manage the time, and you manage the problem. And that's what we're seeing both around water sources. That's what we're seeing both in national parks and communal lands. How nature would traditionally solve this problem of time to make sure the cattle don't come back, or the buffalo or the animals don't come back and re-eat the growing grass. There's a great synergy between the animal dung, how quickly it deteriorates or gets absorbed by nature or gets cycled back into the soil. There's a correlation between how long that takes and how quickly the grass recovers. What's fascinating is when growing conditions are really good, there's a lot of moisture, temperature's right, and grass is growing really quickly. Under those conditions, dung cycles quite quickly. And what we saw this last year by us is we had a mid-season in December, we had a dry spell, and growth rates for grass just slowed right down because moisture was removed. We didn't have rain, or coincidentally, dung circulation slowed down as well. How nature avoids this is large herds. Now, when I say large herds, thousands of animals competing with each other, large herds in their thousands, dunging and urinating over their food. So if you're in competition in a large herd, now when I say large, I'm meaning thousands. And you can't go back, because I've defecated and urinated there. I can only move forward. And you see the buffalo, when they're moving, they're eating like this. And they can't come back. And the only time they'll come back is when there's all sign of dung and urine is gone, because they don't want to eat that. And that coincidentally means it's when the grass is recovered. It's beauty of nature, how they figured that, how nature's solved this riddle. So that's how nature would do it. Now, one of the let's just go straight to that one. One of the other things that happens when an animal is left to linger and graze grass like that, that doesn't mean there's processes here that's at play as well. Doesn't mean this is all healthy and waiting for it to erect. Remember, we said if the grass is left unattended, it starts to deteriorate. So that's overgrazing. This is overrest. And this is the situation of our national parks and communal lands. They're being overgrazed and overrested at the same time. So how nature would solve that one, and this gets back to behavior, how behavior is critical. Because if you put up a fence and you could put a lot of cattle, but if you put them in, they'll all separate eventually and start doing their own thing. You need them to stay reasonably close and move around. Herd of buffalo as well. But if they're left to linger, they'll just slowly eat away. But with the predator-prey relationship, when we look, what conventional belief is that large ruminants, the only way that they interact with their environment is through what they eat. They eat and dung and urinate. But no one thinks about what the physical impact of a large herd of 2,000 buffalo will do physically onto the land. And so here, I will play it now. This is a time lapse of about an hour. There's a herd of about 500 buffalo in the tree line there. They are going to walk across this grassland. Let me just play that for you. And just look at the grass. Now they're just grazing it. They look moving a little quickly because it's a time lapse. But they separated but constantly moving because they don't want to eat each other's dung and then move across. The impact here was literally just eating and grazing. And there's not much impact. Chuck in some lions. Now think of that physical impact that herd's having on the land. 1,000 buffalo running like that. They're doing some job. What's critical is this doesn't happen all the time. Lion hunt would occur until they've caught one. It might take them a couple of hours to kill it, but the herd being chased might be a half hour to an hour at most. Ordeal. And then the herd settles down and carries on grazing. But for that half hour, they've physically impacted the ground. Now, where would this occur usually? Well, the buffaloes, they would go and graze and then rest up where they feel safe and chew the cud, which is often open areas, which is often the areas that are over-rested and barren, and that's where the impact's needed. So if we got this situation where the moribunds happen, you run a herd of 2,000 buffalo over there, what they've done is flatten the grass, expose the growing points to the grass, created a mulch layer, so when the rains do fall, the ground's protected, and off we go. The nutrients are there to be cycled to replenish this plant, and off. That behavior, it's just a behavior changes, breaks the cycle. The other thing that it happens is in areas where the soil is completely bare, you can imagine 1,000 buffaloes is like someone going with a buzzer and just quickly tapping like this, breaking the soil, enabling air to move in and out, enabling water to go in. It enables the soil to breathe once that cap's removed. And you can imagine there's a capped herd of buffalo comes across, exposes air and water. The seeds bank is there. There's always seeds in the grass. You just need to change the germinating conditions. As soon as you've changed it, you start sprouting. And that's these big capped areas. Run a big herd of buffalo over them and you'll see the change that will come. Okay, and that leads to the last point. We've sort of given some insights on those processes. Now, the other thing that we need to look at, there's been clues, and this is when it comes to management of these things, there's been clues throughout history, and Chief Seattle said it, humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do unto ourselves. All things are bound together and all things are connected. And that gives a clue to what I'm going to speak about now, and it's critical that behavior. Here's monopools. Can't tell you the year. And then if you've ever taken a boat down from Chirundu to monopools, and you go down the Zambian side, it looks like that. That's the Zambian GMA, just outside the Lower Zambezi National Park. All the animals that you get here, Nyala, but generally all the animals that you get here, you'll get here. All the animals. Except one species has changed their behavior. Just one. And that's the catalyst for this big change. Sorry. And that's human beings. We are the ones. We changed our behavior, and then as a result, all other animals change their behavior to adjust to that. Here, it's the GMA, the game management area. There's still communal lands there. I'm not saying that this is ideal. I can tell you now for certain behind these trees it looks bad. But if you look just at where water meets land, that's pretty stable. Here, animals are harassed, if not hunted. So if an elephant wants to drink there, he goes to the water, he drinks and he gets away. The plant's given time to recover. Where here, the tourists actually love the elephants next to the water and take pictures and everything. So the elephants are left to linger. And that brings me to the point of holes and holism. It's a difficult subject to talk about, but I'm going to try and do it in layman's terms. Alan Savory often speaks to it as individual parts do not exist in nature, only wholes, and these form and shape each other. The way I try and explain is whole communities. If you look at me as an individual, there's a percentage of me that's human being, human cells, but there's a greater percentage of me that is stomach biome, all my bugs that keep me healthy here, all the bugs on the side outside my skin biome. Without that life, I will actually be ill and sick. I need these things to be a complete person, a complete healthy human being. That's the whole that is me. And the whole that I'm part of is the community that I'm part of at Dibangombe. If I get ill because I've taken some sort of chemical that's destroyed my bugs, and I'm sick, suddenly I'm not at work that day, and then that has a ripple effect because the cattle didn't get something that they needed. That's the holism, these connections of life. So how I manage myself is vital to the survival of my community, which is Dibangombe. If I use an example of a rock pool, which is, if that's a whole, the whole community that is a rock pool, and we tamper with any single one of them, there'll be repercussions to it. And there was actually an experiment done with that, where they removed the starfish. 1 year later, species diminished. 5 years later, there was only mussels left. They tampered with one species. And this is the intricacies of nature. When we manage these things, we can't manage things in isolation. We have to manage the whole. But you can't also define the whole as just the rock pool, because there are creatures that come from the beach that visit this area and go back. There's ocean water that replenishes here and things that go in and out. So, for example, if you're managing the Hwange, you can't just manage Hwange as the national park. You'd have to include the communities that are around it. That is the bigger picture here. And if you look at that way. So holism explains the complexity of life. We human beings are not very good at managing things with intricate connections. We're very good at singular things. For example, if I wake up in the morning and my car's not starting, you just go through a sequence of events. Is the battery, is there fuel? You just go through that. You go through that process, and you find where the problem is and fix that, and you're off to the races. Where you can't do that within a realm of an ecosystem or anything like that, because you pull on one string, there'll be ripple effects. all our management decisions will have intended outcomes and unintended outcomes. And these could be positive, negative, short-term and long-term. We don't know what our decisions, what the outcomes are within the realm of a complex thing like an ecosystem. So one of the things we encourage when people come and visit us at Dibangombe is to try and see that whole and describe how to manage that. And that last point is critical, managing for what we want and not for what we don't want. This, for example, a lot of, if I was a cropping person and you're in that sequence of events of, I don't want pests, okay, then I'll apply pesticide. If I don't want fungi, I'll put herbicide. And then you'll see the knock-on effects throughout your crops for that. So rather manage for what you want. And you need to describe that. You need to have a direction. You can't just make it up as you go along. Okay, so that's sort of, I don't know what the time limit there was, John, but I think we're coming to the end there. So what we do at Dibangombe is break paradigms in two ways. What we covered tonight is a tidbit of the ecological literacy that we teach people for them to understand how these things function. And then the other side of it is we help people, once they understand how nature functions, we then help them how to manage it. The decision making around that. Okay, and then I'm going to leave you with this at the end. Whether we and our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all our deals and decisions. She has more votes, a longer memory, a sterner sense of justice than we do. It's from Wendell Berry. Fluit, my story is uit. There we go. Hope you enjoyed that.
I think I learned a huge amount. So thank you so much to Etienne for covering this topic. I'd like to open it up to you guys down here.